They ordered the old veteran to leave, until 6 U.S. Marines stood up at once. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Picture this, a crisp morning at a military base, the kind of day where everything feels like it's in place, until the unexpected happens. At the entrance to the military ceremony, an elderly man, dressed in a faded jacket, stood before the guards. His hands were gnarled, his posture stooped with age, but his gaze remained steady, focused, and undeterred. He wasn't here to cause trouble. He simply wanted to pay his respects. But the two young guards standing at the gate were about to make a decision that would change everything. They eyed the old man suspiciously. "Sorry, sir, but this is a restricted area. I'm going to have to ask you to leave," one of them said sharply. The other guard crossed his arms and smirked. "Yeah, Grandpa, this isn't the place for you." The old man didn't flinch. He didn't argue. His silence, in the face of their taunts, only seemed to aggravate them further. One of the guards leaned forward. "Look, I don't have time for this. Either you leave now, or we'll escort you out." The old man, with an almost imperceptible sigh, straightened his back. "I'm here for the general. He would have wanted me here," he said, his voice quiet but firm. The guards laughed, dismissing him instantly. "Sure, buddy," one guard said sarcastically. "And I'm the Secretary of Defense." The old man's eyes did not leave the gate, the distant hills, or the flags at half-mast. His silence was as powerful as any words he might have spoken. As the standoff continued, more cars arrived, their occupants casting curious and judgmental glances at the scene. The old man's calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the growing tension. The younger guard, whose name was Corporal Jennings, stepped closer. "You're really going to make us do this?" he sneered. "If you want to see a grave, the public entrance is that way." The air grew thick with the unspoken weight of disrespect, and yet the old man didn't move. His gaze, unwavering, remained on the ceremony in the distance. Jennings threw his hands up in frustration. "All right, that's it. We've got a motorcade coming, and you're creating a problem." He reached for his radio, preparing to escalate things. But just as he did, another figure stepped forward. It was Captain Hayes, a young officer who had been observing the situation from a distance. He had seen enough. Something didn't sit right with him about this. He took a deep breath and approached. "What's going on here?" Hayes asked, his voice calm but laced with authority. He took a look at the old man, then at the guards, and saw the disrespect in their eyes. It was all too familiar. "Sir, this man claims he knows the general," Jennings said, still brimming with arrogance. "But he doesn't have an invite, and he refuses to leave." Hayes looked at the old man once more, something about him stirring a memory. He turned to the guards. "I want you to stand down. I'll take it from here." The tension broke, but not in the way the guards had expected. As Hayes moved to speak with the old man, something deep within him clicked. His mind raced. Was this man more than he appeared? There was something about the old man's bearing, his composure in the face of such disrespect. Hayes couldn't put his finger on it, but he knew this wasn't an ordinary situation. His instincts kicked in. "I'm going to call this in," Hayes said quietly. He walked away, his mind already racing to make sense of what he had just witnessed. Back at the main command center, Hayes made the call that would change everything. He spoke to Colonel Markinson, a man who had known the general for years. When Markinson heard the name of the old man, his reaction was immediate. "I need you to stop everything," Markinson ordered, his voice now taut with urgency. "Get the general on the line. We're moving out." This is no ordinary veteran. The command center erupted into action as the colonel's orders were relayed through the ranks. A convoy was quickly assembled, military vehicles rolling out in response to the unfolding situation. At the same time, the old man remained still, standing by the gate, completely unaware of the storm that was about to descend upon the base. The guards were oblivious to the fact that they had just made the gravest of errors. They thought they had control of the situation, but they were about to be proven wrong. As the convoy sped toward the gate, the sound of screeching tires and the sight of blacked-out SUVs cut through the air, signaling the arrival of the general and the chain of command. In that moment, Everything stopped. The guards froze, realizing that they had underestimated the quiet old man in front of them. As the convoy roared towards the base, the air seemed to thicken with every passing second. The black SUVs, each more intimidating than the last, screeched to a halt at the gates, their tires kicking up dust in the early morning light. The guards, who had been standing tall just moments before, froze in place as the first officer stepped out of the lead vehicle. His sharp, crisp uniform gleamed in the sunlight, and his cold, commanding presence seemed to draw the very air around him taut with authority. The young guards could feel their breath catch in their throats as the man, flanked by two others in matching attire, walked toward them with an intensity that could only come from someone used to holding absolute power. The older man, the one they had dismissed so easily, stood at attention without being told. His posture remained perfect, his gaze unwavering as the general approached. Captain Hayes, still reeling from his phone call with Colonel Markinson, stood in the background, watching the scene unfold. He felt a sense of awe that he couldn't explain. The old man, who had been treated with such disregard moments ago, was now the focal point of the most senior officer's attention. The guards stood, their hands trembling slightly as they realized the gravity of the situation. They had been out of their depth from the start. The general stopped in front of the old man, his eyes locking onto him with a mixture of reverence and understanding. For a brief moment, the general's gaze softened, as if he recognized something far beyond the surface. The stillness was palpable. It felt as if time itself had stopped. Then, with the deliberate precision that only a man who had commanded armies could execute, the general raised his hand to his brow in the sharpest salute any of them had ever witnessed. The sound of the crisp salute echoed in the otherwise silent space, a sound that resonated deeply with everyone present. The guards, who had just moments before been so sure of themselves, now stood with their backs straight, their gazes fixed on the ground in utter respect. The general did not take his eyes off the old man. "Mr. Miller," the general's voice broke the silence, deep and commanding. "It is an honor, sir. I am deeply sorry for the actions of my men." The words hung in the air, heavy with a weight that could not be ignored. The young guards, still standing at attention, could only glance at each other, their faces ashen. They had no idea who this man really was, but they could now feel the deep respect emanating from the general. The old man, John Miller, stood silent for a moment, his eyes glistening ever so slightly. The memories of the past, those long, bloody years spent in the jungles, the sweat and blood spilled, the comrades lost, rushed back to him. But there was no bitterness in his heart. He had lived with those memories for decades. His only wish now was for the men he had served with to be remembered as heroes. "I'm just here to pay my respects," Miller replied softly, his voice steady despite the turmoil of emotions that seemed to flood through him. The general nodded, his expression softening, and gestured to the other officers to step aside. "Let's get you inside," he said, his voice laced with authority. "You've earned the right to be here." As they walked towards the center of the ceremony, the crowd began to whisper. The officers, the dignitaries, the high-ranking military personnel who had once been so focused on their own importance now fell silent as they caught sight of Miller. Their eyes widened in recognition, though few could place the name or face. But the way the general treated him, the way the entire atmosphere seemed to shift when he entered the room, spoke volumes. "General, what is this?" one of the officers whispered to a colleague, though he dared not speak too loudly. The colonel, who had been by the general's side throughout the event, leaned in. "That is John Miller," he said quietly, his tone low but full of respect. "The man we've all heard stories about. He saved countless lives during the war. He was more than just a soldier. He was a legend." The realization spread like wildfire through the room. The officers who had once looked past Miller now stared at him with awe. The guards, standing awkwardly in the corner, could only watch as the crowd shifted to make way for him. They had no idea who they had just dismissed so easily, but they would soon learn. Miller took his place at the front, the general standing beside him. Together, they looked at the flag-draped casket, the air thick with the weight of memories and the loss of a man who had served with honor. The general turned to him once more, his gaze filled with a deep respect. "This is your moment, John," he said softly. "This is where you belong." Miller nodded, his heart heavy with the knowledge that his old friend, The man who had been by his side through so many battles was finally being honored. And though the years had passed, and his body had aged and weakened, his spirit remained as strong as ever. The ceremony had shifted from a somber moment to something far greater, as if the presence of John Miller, the old man who had been dismissed as nothing more than a relic, had transformed the entire event. People now watched him with a mixture of awe and disbelief, their whispers trailing in the air, but none dared to speak too loudly. They could feel the weight of the room shift as Miller walked slowly, the general at his side, his gaze unshaken by the sudden attention. A slight tremor in Miller's hand as he reached out to touch the edge of the podium was the only sign of the age that had caught up with him. The rest of him stood tall, like the man he had once been in the heat of battle. Miller felt the eyes of the crowd on him, but it didn't faze him. He had stood in far more intimidating situations, in jungles where every breath could be your last, under fire, and in the faces of the enemies who would have gladly killed him without a second thought. Yet none of that mattered. Now, he wasn't there for the ceremony or the honors. He was there to remember a friend who had been by his side when it counted most. The general, noticing his quiet demeanor, turned to him with a nod. "The men are still talking about you, John," he said softly, keeping his voice low so the others couldn't overhear. "They don't know the full story. They think you're just another veteran, but they don't know what you did, what you gave, the way you saved lives." Miller nodded, his expression unchanged. He wasn't interested in the accolades or the stories that would surely be told after he was gone. His thoughts were elsewhere, on a time long ago, when he had been young, and his world had been filled with the sounds of helicopters and the constant tension of waiting for the next battle. "The only reward I needed," Miller murmured, "was seeing my boys come home." The general's voice softened. "And they did, because of you." A sudden wave of emotion hit Miller, but he kept his composure, his eyes fixed ahead. He wasn't here to be celebrated. He was here for closure, for a final farewell to a man he had saved all those years ago. Behind him, the crowd slowly started to gather, the ceremony about to commence in full. The older veterans who had recognized him from the moment he entered were now whispering among themselves. A few of them nodded in recognition. They knew exactly who he was. They had heard the stories, perhaps even lived through them. But none had known the man standing before them, the quiet figure in the worn jacket, who had once been a legend of his own. The general turned again, his gaze sweeping over the crowd of men and women, all of them standing at attention, paying their respects. "For those of you who don't know," the general's voice boomed, "this is John Miller. Some of you may have heard his name before, but there are others here who know exactly who he is. For those of you who don't, let me tell you this. John Miller is the man who saved General Wallace's life during the war. He's the man who rescued his team when no one else could. He's the man who took 100 risks for 100 men and who never once sought recognition." The crowd fell into stunned silence as the full weight of the general's words sank in. A few of the younger officers stood with their mouths slightly agape, unable to process what they were hearing. Some of the older veterans stood straighter, their eyes filled with admiration. They knew the story, but hearing it from the general gave it an entirely new weight. "John Miller is a living legend," the general continued. "He saved my life, and many others. And today, we honor him not just as a soldier, but as the hero he has always been." At those words, the crowd stood even straighter, the tension in the room palpable as the old man, who had been brushed aside moments ago, was now standing at the center of the ceremony, the focal point of everyone's attention. The respect in the room was undeniable. Miller didn't need to say a word. His presence spoke volumes. He had earned his place here, in this moment, and he was determined to see it through. As the ceremony continued, the general led him forward, placing a hand on his shoulder as they both turned toward the flag-draped casket. Miller stood in solemn silence, eyes fixed on the flag, remembering the men he had lost, the battles fought, and the long road that had brought him here today. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped, as if the world itself had taken a breath in reverence. He wasn't just an old veteran anymore. He was a symbol of everything that had been sacrificed. And in that moment, surrounded by those who had once doubted him, he knew that he was finally being recognized for the man he truly was. The ceremony was coming to a close, but for John Miller, the significance of the moment wasn't in the accolades or the recognition. It wasn't about the title or the speeches that would follow. It was about the quiet, fleeting memories of the men he had fought beside. He could feel the weight of those memories pressing on him, a quiet ache that seemed to grow stronger with each passing year. As the general's words continued to echo in his ears, Miller couldn't help but glance at the faces in the crowd. The younger soldiers who had once looked at him with disdain now stood in reverence, their heads slightly bowed. Some of them seemed uncomfortable, unsure of what to say or do, their eyes darting to the old man who had been standing at the center of the ceremony. But they no longer mocked him. They no longer questioned his place here. Miller felt their gazes, but he didn't let them affect him. He had seen the worst of what the world had to offer, and the approval of others was no longer necessary. He had found peace in the quiet moments of reflection, in the knowledge that he had lived a life of purpose. As the crowd began to disperse, a young officer approached him. Miller recognized him from earlier, the one who had been standing beside the guards, unsure of what to make of the situation. The officer hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Mr. Miller," he began, his voice steady but respectful. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for the way we treated you earlier." Miller nodded, his expression unchanged. He had heard those words many times before, and they no longer held the weight they once did. But this time, there was something different in the officer's tone, something genuine. "It's all right," Miller replied softly, his voice calm and measured. "I don't need an apology." The officer seemed taken aback, but Miller's words seemed to resonate with him. He stood there for a moment, silent, before offering a small nod. I didn't realize who you were. What you've done. What you mean to this unit," the officer said, his voice trailing off. Miller gave a small smile, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "It's not about what I did," he said quietly. "It's about what we all did together." The officer looked at him, as if trying to understand. "You saved countless lives," he said. "You've earned every bit of respect you've been given today." Miller looked back at him, his gaze steady. "I didn't do it for respect," he replied. "I did it because I had a job to do. And I did it because I promised the men I served with that I would bring them home." The officer seemed to absorb his words, nodding slowly. There was a pause, and then he spoke again. "I'll never forget what I saw today," he said. "The way the general treated you, the way everyone stood in respect. I can't imagine what it must have been like for you, to be dismissed so easily, only to have the entire unit stand for you." Miller's eyes softened. He had seen the way the world worked, how the young often forgot the sacrifices of the old. But today, in this moment, he felt something different. He felt that the world was beginning to understand. "It's not about what they see," Miller said, his voice calm but resolute. "It's about what we know, what we remember, the bond we shared." The officer didn't say anything for a moment. Then, with a nod, he stepped back, offering Miller one last respectful salute before turning to join the others. Miller watched him go, the noise of the ceremony fading into the background as he stood there, alone with his thoughts. He had never sought recognition or fame. He had never asked for the kind of ceremony or accolades that had been bestowed upon him today. What mattered, to him, was the knowledge that he had done his duty, that he had kept his promises. And in the quiet moments like this, when the world seemed to slow, he could finally allow himself to feel the weight of the journey, the weight of the lives he had touched, the lives he had saved, the lives he had lost. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. For a moment, it felt as if time had stopped, the noise of the world muted by the steady pulse of his own heart. He didn't need anyone to tell him who he was. He had known all along. As the final notes of the ceremony played, Miller turned and began to walk away, his steps steady and sure, a man at peace with the life he had lived. The young officer watched him leave, the weight of Miller's words settling in his mind. He would never forget this day, the day that he had learned what it truly meant to serve. The days following the ceremony were filled with an unexpected quiet, as John Miller returned to his life of solitude. He had never been one for crowds or the spotlight, and though the recognition had been overwhelming, he felt a sense of peace knowing that, for once, his story had been told. The world around him had shifted, but for him, the change was subtle. He continued to spend his days tending to his small home, his hands working the land that had been his refuge for so many years. But even in this quiet life, the echoes of the past would not leave him. One afternoon, as he sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he heard the familiar rumble of an engine in the distance. It was not the sound of his usual neighbors passing by, but something deeper, more purposeful. He stood slowly, his old joints creaking, and peered down the dirt road. A convoy of military vehicles was approaching. The dust kicked up behind them as they made their way toward his home. Miller's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, the familiar weight of his memories pressed against him. He didn't know who these men were, but he knew that when military vehicles came, they came with purpose. The convoy pulled up to his porch, and the vehicles came to a stop. The doors opened, and from one of the SUVs stepped a man Miller instantly recognized. It was Captain Hayes, the same officer who had spoken to him after the ceremony, the one who had shown him respect when so many had shown none. He was now standing in front of Miller, his posture straight, his face serious but respectful. "Mr. Miller," Hayes said, his voice carrying the weight of the moment. "We need your help." Miller's eyes narrowed slightly. "What's going on, Captain?" Hayes hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure of how to begin. "We've got a situation, a critical one, and we need someone with your experience." Miller's brow furrowed. "I'm just a quiet old man, Captain. I don't know what you think I can do." Hayes stepped closer, lowering his voice. "It's not about what you think you can do. It's about what you've done in the past. We've got an operation, and it requires someone who's been there, who knows what it's like in the field. We need someone who can handle the pressure." Miller stood silent for a moment, his thoughts drifting back to the days of war, when every decision had been life or death, when the weight of responsibility had never felt so heavy. He had stepped away from that life long ago. He had promised himself that he would never return to the front lines, that he would leave the battlefield to the younger men. But here he was again, faced with a choice he never thought he'd have to make. "You're asking me to go back," Miller said quietly, his voice carrying a tinge of reluctance. Hayes nodded. "We need you, sir. There's no one else with the kind of experience you have, the kind of leadership." Miller's eyes softened, but only for a moment. He had seen the young officers, the ones who had no idea what it truly meant to lead, to be responsible for the lives of others. He had been that officer once, but now, it was different. He wasn't sure if he still had what it took to be that man again. But something in Hayes's voice, the sincerity, the trust, made him pause. "What's the mission?" Miller asked, his voice steady. Hayes seemed to relax slightly, as if the hardest part had already been said. "We're going into a hostile area. We need to extract a team of our men who've been cut off behind enemy lines. We've tried everything, but we need someone who knows how to think outside the box. Someone who can do what others can't." Miller sighed deeply, the weight of the request settling in his chest. It had been years since he had been in the field, years since he had risked his life for anyone but himself. But he could feel the old instincts stirring, the ones that had never truly gone away. He knew the stakes were high, and he knew that if he didn't step up, someone else would have to, someone who might not make it out alive. The decision was made. Miller nodded, the corners of his mouth twitching into a small, knowing smile. "All right, Captain, let's get to work." Hayes looked at him, surprised, but his face broke into a relieved grin. "Thank you, sir. I knew we could count on you." As Miller followed Hayes toward the convoy, his mind raced. He was about to re-enter a world he thought he had left behind forever. But he wasn't just an old man anymore. He wasn't just a relic of the past. He was a man who had lived through battles, who had seen the worst the world had to offer, and still found a way to survive. He wasn't done yet. And this mission would be his final chapter, the one that would see him walk away with his head held high, knowing he had done what was necessary. As the convoy rumbled off down the road, Miller's eyes glanced at the rearview mirror, watching his small house fade into the distance. The past might have shaped him, but it was the future, the unknown, that would define him. The convoy moved steadily down the narrow, winding road, the hum of the engines and the distant chatter of radios filling the air. John Miller sat in the back of the lead vehicle, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his mind drifting back to the mission at hand. They were heading into enemy territory, into a place where every decision could mean the difference between life and death. But Miller had been here before. He had fought in places where the air smelled of smoke and fear, where every step forward felt like walking on a razor's edge. Now, decades later, he was being asked to return to that world, to make decisions he thought he had left behind. The young soldiers in the convoy were nervous, he could tell. They were quiet, their faces tense, their fingers tapping anxiously on weapons that were now too familiar. He could see the doubt in their eyes, the uncertainty that only experience could erase. They had never seen the things he had seen, never lived through the chaos of battle. But he knew something they didn't. They were still learning. He had already learned everything the hard way. "You good, sir?" Captain Hayes asked, glancing back at Miller. His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of concern. Miller gave him a small smile. "I'm good, Captain," he replied, his voice calm. "Just thinking." Hayes nodded, but Miller could tell he didn't fully understand. Hayes hadn't been through what Miller had. He hadn't had to make the impossible choices, hadn't had to live with the consequences of those decisions. They drove on in silence, the weight of the mission pressing on them all. The vehicle turned onto a dirt road that led into the heart of the wilderness, the dense trees and underbrush closing in around them. The convoy slowed as they approached the drop-off point, a clearing just beyond the tree line. The plan was simple. They would move in, extract the trapped soldiers, and get out before the enemy had a chance to respond. But nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. Miller's thoughts drifted back to his younger days, when he had been the one leading a team into hostile terrain. He remembered the adrenaline, the rush of knowing that the next decision could save or cost lives. But back then, it had been easier. He had believed in the mission, in the clarity of the objective. Now, all he felt was the weight of the years, the knowledge that he had already given everything he could. The convoy came to a stop, and the soldiers quickly began to disembark, moving with practiced efficiency. Miller took a deep breath, his boots crunching on the gravel as he stepped out of the vehicle. His back ached, but he pushed through it. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about the men they were going to save. As they moved into position, Miller could feel the old instincts kicking in. He surveyed the area, his sharp eyes scanning the tree line, looking for any signs of movement. The world around him was eerily quiet, the only sounds coming from the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant calls of birds. It felt too calm, too still. The enemy was out there, watching, waiting. They always were. "All set, sir," a young soldier called out, his voice tight with nerves. Miller nodded without looking at him. He didn't need to say anything. The soldier knew what to do. They all did. They had been trained for this moment. The tension in the air was palpable as the team moved deeper into the forest, the trees closing in around them like walls. Miller led the way, his mind focused entirely on the mission ahead. He was no longer the old man who had been dismissed at the ceremony, no longer the relic of the past. In this moment, he was the leader, the one who had the experience, the one who knew what to do. The rest of the soldiers followed his lead, their movements swift and silent. The clearing was just ahead, and Miller could see the faint outlines of the trapped soldiers in the distance. They were huddled together, their backs to the trees, their faces grim. The enemy was close. Miller could feel it. He motioned for the team to stop, and they froze, their weapons at the ready. He moved to the front, crouching low to the ground. He could hear the faint rustle of leaves, the soft crackle of branches. The enemy was closing in. It was now or never. "On me," Miller whispered, his voice low but commanding. The team moved with precision, their steps silent as they closed in on the trapped soldiers. Miller's heart raced, but his hands remained steady. He had been here before, and he knew what needed to be done. As they reached the soldiers, Miller motioned for them to move quickly. They had to get out of here before the enemy caught wind of their presence. "We're getting you out," Miller said, his voice calm but firm. The soldiers looked up at him, their faces a mix of relief and disbelief. "You're here," one of them said, his voice hoarse. "I thought we were done for." Miller didn't say anything. He just nodded, his eyes scanning the area. They didn't have time for a conversation. They had to move. The team worked quickly, securing the trapped soldiers and preparing to leave. But just as they were about to head back to the convoy, the sound of footsteps echoed through the trees. Miller's instincts kicked in. The enemy had found them. He motioned for everyone to fall back. The extraction was about to get a lot more complicated. The enemy had found them. Miller's heart raced as he motioned for the team to fall back, the faint sounds of boots crunching through the dry leaves growing louder with each passing second. He could feel the tension in the air, the unmistakable sense that they were running out of time. The mission was slipping through their fingers, and failure was no longer an option. The trapped soldiers had been counting on them, and now, every second counted. Miller moved swiftly, his body responding automatically as he signaled to Captain Hayes to take the rear. The convoy was still waiting at the extraction point, but the route was no longer clear. The forest around them seemed to close in, the dense underbrush making movement slow and cumbersome. The crackling sound of footsteps behind them told Miller everything he needed to know. The enemy was closing in. He turned to one of the younger soldiers, a man barely out of his teens, his eyes wide with fear. "Stay close," Miller whispered, his voice low and commanding. The young soldier nodded, his hands gripping his weapon tighter as they continued to move through the trees. Miller's mind raced. They had to get out. They had to keep the enemy from surrounding them. Every step had to be calculated. Every move had to be precise. As they moved deeper into the forest, the noise behind them grew louder, more frantic. The enemy was closing in faster than Miller had anticipated. There was no way they could outrun them now. They had to fight. Miller turned to the soldiers, his voice calm but urgent. "We're going to make a stand here. We don't leave anyone behind." "Got it." The soldiers nodded, their faces grim. They were ready. Miller's instincts had kicked in. He knew what had to be done. He motioned to Hayes, signaling for him to take the high ground. Hayes gave him a quick nod and moved into position. Miller watched him go, his eyes scanning the area, searching for anything that could give them an advantage. The trees around them were thick, but there were enough gaps to create a kill zone. They would make their stand here. The first few rounds rang out, the crack of gunfire splitting the silence. Miller didn't hesitate. He dropped to one knee, aiming his rifle with practiced precision. He picked off the first enemy soldier, his shot true. The enemy returned fire, the sound of bullets whizzing through the trees. Miller's pulse quickened, but his hands remained steady. He fired again, and another enemy soldier dropped. Hayes' voice crackled through the radio. "We've got a few more coming in from the right," he said. Miller gritted his teeth. "Hold your ground. We can't let them surround us." The soldiers took cover behind trees, returning fire as the enemy pushed forward. Miller's eyes narrowed as he watched the movement in the distance. He could see them now, a small group of enemy soldiers advancing, their rifles raised. He fired again, taking out one of them, but the others were closing in. The young soldier beside Miller was shaking, his eyes wide with fear. "I can't do this," he muttered, his voice cracking. Miller didn't have time to reassure him. He turned to the soldier, his voice steady and commanding. "You can, and you will. Focus on your training. Stay with me." The soldier nodded, though it was clear that fear still gripped him. Miller turned back to the front, his eyes scanning for the next target. The enemy was getting closer. They were too close now. Miller took a deep breath and steadied his rifle. He had been in situations like this before, but it didn't make it any easier. The stakes were higher now. The young soldiers were depending on him. The crack of gunfire rang out again, and Miller saw one of his men go down. His heart skipped a beat, but there was no time to mourn. They had to keep fighting. "Cover fire," Miller shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. The soldiers fired in unison, providing cover for their fallen comrade as they moved back into position. Miller didn't look back. He kept his focus on the advancing enemy, his eyes locked on their movements. He fired again, another enemy soldier falling to the ground. The gunfire seemed to slow, the intensity fading as the enemy began to retreat. Miller's breath came in ragged gasps, but he didn't let up. They weren't out of danger yet. He motioned for the team to move, his hand signaling for them to fall back to the extraction point. They were losing ground, but they weren't beaten yet. "Keep moving," he ordered. "We get to that extraction point, and we don't stop." The soldiers scrambled to their feet, moving quickly but cautiously, their weapons raised as they continued to fall back. The enemy had pulled back for now, but Miller knew that wouldn't last long. He glanced at Hayes, who was now covering their rear. "How much further?" he asked over the radio. "About a quarter mile," Hayes replied, his voice steady. "Just a little longer." Miller nodded, pushing himself forward. The extraction point was in sight now, a small clearing just beyond the trees. He could see the convoy waiting, but the enemy wasn't far behind. "We're almost there," Miller muttered to himself. "Just a little longer." The enemy was regrouping, and the sound of their footsteps grew louder, but Miller was determined to get everyone out. As they reached the extraction point, Miller turned and faced the incoming enemy. The convoy was ready. The team was ready. And Miller knew they weren't going to leave anyone behind. The extraction point was now only a few hundred yards away, but the enemy was closing in fast. Miller could hear the sound of their footsteps growing louder, their voices drifting through the trees. He could sense the tension in the air, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. There was no time to waste. The convoy was ready, but they needed to move quickly if they were going to make it out in one piece. Miller turned to the soldiers behind him, his voice low but firm. "Stay sharp. We're almost there." The soldiers, though exhausted, nodded in response, their eyes locked on the path ahead. They had been through hell together, but this was different. This time, the stakes were higher. Miller could feel the weight of their trust in him, but there was no room for error. Not now. Not when they were so close. As they moved forward, Miller's thoughts drifted back to the moment when he had first agreed to come back. He had known it wouldn't be easy, but he had underestimated just how much it would take out of him. The years had changed him. He wasn't the young man who had stormed through battlefields without a second thought. He was older now, with more scars, both seen and unseen. But there was something else inside him, something that had never faded, even with time. It was the drive to protect, to ensure that those he cared about made it out alive. The convoy had reached the edge of the clearing, and Miller signaled for them to stop. He moved to the front, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of the enemy. The trees were thick here, but the open space beyond the clearing offered no cover. If the enemy pushed forward now, they would be exposed. Miller didn't need to look behind him to know that the others were in position. Hayes and the rest of the team had fallen into their roles seamlessly, their training kicking in without a second thought. They were ready. But Miller knew that the moment the enemy made their move, the situation would turn into chaos. He could feel the tension building, the quiet before the storm. "On my mark," Miller whispered into the radio. "We move." No hesitation. The soldiers nodded, their weapons at the ready. Miller took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the path ahead. The enemy was close now, and he could hear the sound of their footsteps growing louder. They were coming. It was time. "Move out," Miller commanded. The soldiers sprang into action, sprinting across the clearing with swift, controlled movements. The sound of gunfire erupted behind them, and Miller felt the heat of the battle pressing in on him. His focus remained sharp, his mind working through the steps ahead. He couldn't afford to let the fear take over, not now. Not when they were so close to the finish line. As they reached the halfway point of the clearing, Miller turned to see a group of enemy soldiers pushing through the trees, their weapons raised. Without hesitation, Miller aimed and fired, his shot taking out the first enemy soldier in an instant. The others scattered, taking cover behind trees and rocks, returning fire. Miller ducked down behind a large boulder, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the crackle of gunfire all around him, the sound of bullets whizzing through the air. "We're almost there," Hayes called out from behind him. Miller nodded, his eyes fixed on the clearing ahead. They had to make it. They had to get to the convoy. The sound of more enemy footsteps filled the air, and Miller knew they had to move quickly. He signaled to the soldiers to push forward. "We don't stop," he shouted over the noise. "Get to the convoy." The soldiers surged forward, their movements quick and precise. They were so close now, so close to freedom. Miller could see the vehicles up ahead, the convoy waiting for them. But just as they reached the final stretch of open ground, a burst of gunfire rang out from behind them, and one of the soldiers fell to the ground. Miller's heart skipped a beat. He turned and saw the soldier lying motionless in the grass, blood seeping from his chest. "Cover fire," Miller shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. The soldiers fired in unison, creating a wall of gunfire that forced the enemy to retreat. Miller didn't look back. He kept his eyes on the convoy, urging the remaining soldiers forward. They couldn't afford to lose anyone else. As the last soldier reached the convoy, Miller took one final look at the clearing behind them. The enemy was retreating for now, but he knew they wouldn't stop. They would be back, and next time, they would be ready. The convoy doors slammed shut, and the vehicles roared to life, speeding off into the distance. Miller let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging with relief. They had made it. But the weight of the loss still hung heavy on him. They had lost one of their own, and that would stay with him forever. As the convoy sped toward safety, Miller sat back in his seat, his mind racing. He had done what he had to do. He had kept his promise. But the road ahead would be long, and the scars of this mission would stay with him forever. As the convoy sped away from the extraction point, The sounds of the firefight behind them began to fade into the distance, but the tension in the air remained. Miller sat in the back of the vehicle, his mind working through the mission, the decisions made, and the price that had been paid. The reality of war was never clean. There were no neat endings, no perfect resolutions. It was always the same: survival, sacrifice, and the weight of knowing that someone had to make it through. He looked out the window, watching the landscape blur by, the trees and fields becoming a distant memory. The convoy's engines hummed, and the soldiers inside remained mostly silent. Miller felt the weight of their eyes on him, though no one spoke. They had seen the veteran they had once dismissed, the one who had led them through the toughest of battles. And now, they looked at him not with fear or uncertainty, but with respect. The same respect he had earned all those years ago. But this time, it wasn't just for his actions. It was for the strength that came with surviving so much and still being willing to fight when it mattered most. Miller didn't want the recognition. He didn't need it. But there was something in the way the soldiers had looked at him, something in their silence, that told him they had understood. This wasn't just about saving lives anymore. It was about honoring the men they had become. As the convoy continued its journey, Captain Hayes, who had been sitting beside Miller, leaned over. "We're almost there," he said quietly. "You did good today, sir. We couldn't have done it without you." Miller turned his head to look at Hayes, his face expressionless. "You did just fine, Captain," he replied softly. "We all did." Hayes nodded, but didn't press the matter. They both knew what had really happened out there. The young soldiers had stepped up when it counted. They had fought and survived. And while Miller had been the one to guide them, it was their courage that had made the difference. They had done their part. But the loss of their comrade weighed heavily on Miller's mind. One of them hadn't made it out, and no matter how many victories they had won, that loss would stay with him. They were heading to a safe house now, a temporary base where they would rest and regroup before returning to the front line. But Miller couldn't shake the feeling that the mission wasn't truly over. There would always be another fight, another challenge to face. He had seen it time and time again. But this time, it was different. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a man who had seen the cost of war, and the price of survival was never something you could forget. As the convoy pulled into the safe house, the soldiers disembarked, each one weary but grateful. The night had fallen, and the air was cool, the scent of the trees mingling with the dust of the road. Miller felt the familiar weight of the night pressing on him. The stillness of the world seemed almost too quiet after the chaos of the mission. But in this moment, he knew he could finally take a breath. Hayes approached him again, this time with a more personal expression. "We've got time to rest, sir. You should take it." Miller gave a small nod. He knew Hayes was right. But rest wouldn't come easily. Not after what they had just faced. The loss. The sacrifice. The constant reminder of what it meant to be a soldier. "I'll take a rest when it's over," Miller said quietly. Hayes didn't push him. He understood. Miller had always been that way. Always focused on the mission, always carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. But even the strongest soldiers needed to pause, to find a moment of peace amidst the chaos. The soldiers moved toward the safe house, some chatting quietly, others lost in their own thoughts. Miller stood for a moment, his eyes scanning the surroundings, the familiar stillness of the night settling over him. The mission was over for now, but the journey was far from finished. And as the stars above him twinkled quietly in the sky, Miller couldn't help but think about what would come next. There was always another mission, another fight, and another chance to make a difference. But for now, he allowed himself to close his eyes, to find a moment of peace. And though he knew that sleep would be hard to come by, he also knew that in this moment, he had done everything he could. And that, at least, was enough. The safe house was quiet, the only sounds being the occasional murmur of soldiers moving around and the distant hum of machinery. It was a far cry from the chaos of the mission they had just completed. Miller stood at the window, staring out into the dark, his thoughts distant. He had never been one to dwell on things for too long, but today, something felt different. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to come, something bigger than this mission. Maybe it was the loss of their comrade, or maybe it was the weight of everything he had lived through. But something told him that this wasn't the end. As he turned away from the window, he saw Captain Hayes approaching him. His expression was serious, but there was a subtle note of gratitude in his eyes. "Sir, I wanted to thank you again for everything today," Hayes said, his voice steady but with a hint of respect. "You saved all of us." Miller nodded, his face impassive. "We did it together," he replied, his voice low and measured. Hayes studied him for a moment, then spoke again. "There's more to this mission than we've been told, isn't there?" Miller's eyes narrowed slightly, and Hayes continued. "The way you handled the extraction, the way you moved, it's like you knew what was coming." Miller didn't respond immediately. He had learned long ago that silence was sometimes the best answer. But he couldn't deny that Hayes had a point. There was something about the entire mission that didn't sit right with him. It had been too clean, too easy. They had been fortunate, but luck only lasted so long. "I've seen things before, Captain," Miller finally said, his voice soft but steady. "Things you can't always explain. But I've learned to trust my instincts. And right now, something feels off." Hayes didn't speak at first, but his face betrayed a mixture of concern and understanding. "So what do we do now?" he asked. Miller didn't answer right away. He turned, walking toward the center of the room where the team had gathered. The soldiers were quieter than usual, their faces drawn with exhaustion, but there was a sense of camaraderie among them. They had made it through, but at what cost? Miller's eyes swept over the room, then returned to Hayes. "We wait," he said quietly. "We regroup. And we prepare for whatever comes next." The next few days were a blur of preparation. The soldiers worked tirelessly, checking their gear, reviewing maps, and making sure everything was in place for the next move. Miller kept to himself mostly, staying out of the way but always present when needed. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something was waiting for them just beyond the horizon. Hayes continued to check in with him, but Miller offered little in the way of reassurance. "What do you think will happen?" Hayes asked one evening, as they sat together in the dimly lit safe house. "I think we're being set up," Miller replied, his voice grim. "I don't know by who, but I've seen the signs before. The way things went down with the extraction, it's too clean." Hayes looked at him, his brow furrowed. "What signs?" Miller's eyes met his, and for the first time in days, there was a flicker of doubt in his gaze. "The enemy didn't fight back the way they should have. They let us take the team and get away too easily. It's almost like they wanted us to." Hayes opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated. It made sense, but at the same time, it didn't. They had no way of knowing what the enemy was really up to. Miller could see the uncertainty in his eyes, and for a moment, he regretted speaking so candidly. But he couldn't ignore what his instincts were telling him. "We need to be ready for anything," Miller continued, his voice soft but firm. "When the next move comes, we can't afford to be caught off guard." The days dragged on, but as the sun began to set on the final day at the safe house, Miller's unease only grew. They had made it this far, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the real fight was about to begin. The sound of military vehicles approaching echoed through the camp, and for a brief moment, Miller felt his pulse quicken. This wasn't just routine. It wasn't just another extraction or another mission. He knew deep down that something far more significant was coming. Hayes walked over to him, his face tense with concern. "Sir, we've got a new order," he said, his voice tight with apprehension. "We're moving out again. But this time, it's different. The target is deeper behind enemy lines. And we don't know exactly what we're walking into." Miller nodded, his thoughts racing. He had been in situations like this before. The unknown, the risks, the sacrifice. He had never been afraid of those things. But now, more than ever, he could feel the weight of every decision. They were stepping into something much bigger than they had anticipated. "Get the team ready," Miller said, his voice steady, though his heart was heavy with the burden of what lay ahead. "We're going in." As the soldiers gathered their gear and prepared for the next mission, Miller couldn't help but feel the weight of their trust in him. He had led them this far, but the road ahead was uncertain. He had done everything he could to keep them safe, but the truth was, he couldn't protect them from everything. They were going into unknown territory, and once again, it was up to him to lead them through it. He took a deep breath, and as the convoy began to roll out, he knew that no matter what happened, he would see this mission through. There was no turning back now. The convoy moved through the dense forest, the trees seeming to close in around them as the road grew rougher and more treacherous. The night had fallen, and with it, a heavy silence that felt almost oppressive. Miller sat at the front of the convoy, his eyes scanning the road ahead, his mind running through the mission once again. They were deep in enemy territory now, far beyond the safety of their usual zones. The further they went, the more Miller could feel the weight of every decision. The soldiers behind him were tense, their faces set with determination, but there was an underlying anxiety that they couldn't quite hide. They had all been through hell together, but this time, Miller knew the stakes were higher. Hayes, sitting next to him, looked out the window, his jaw clenched. He had been quiet for most of the journey, but Miller could feel the questions bubbling beneath the surface. The unknown was always the hardest part, and they were heading straight into it. "You're thinking about it, too, aren't you?" Hayes said, breaking the silence. Miller didn't need to ask what he meant. They had both been through enough operations to know that this one felt different. The intel they had received was minimal at best, and the target they were after wasn't just some isolated group. This time, they were going after something bigger. "It doesn't add up," Miller replied quietly, his eyes never leaving the road. "I've seen situations like this before. The way the intel's been handled, the way the mission's been pushed forward, something's off." Hayes nodded, but his expression remained neutral. He trusted Miller, and if Miller said something wasn't right, then they had to be prepared for whatever was coming. But that didn't make the uncertainty any easier to handle. As the convoy continued, the trees around them began to thin, and the sound of the vehicles cutting through the underbrush filled the air. Ahead, the faint glow of a small campfire flickered in the distance. Miller's instincts immediately went on high alert. The fire wasn't supposed to be there. This wasn't a friendly outpost. It was a trap. He motioned for the convoy to slow down. "Get ready," Miller whispered into the radio. "We're about to hit something." The soldiers in the convoy tensed, their hands tightening on their weapons. Miller's voice was steady, but the tension in the air was palpable. They had walked straight into a potential ambush, and every second that passed felt like a countdown to chaos. As they got closer, the shape of the camp became clearer. There were men moving around the fire, shadows in the dark. Miller could see the glint of weapons in the firelight. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as he realized they had been spotted. "Hold positions," Miller ordered. The convoy came to a halt, and the soldiers jumped into action, moving into cover behind trees and rocks. Miller crouched down, his eyes never leaving the fire ahead. They couldn't afford to be caught in the open. "What do we do now?" Hayes asked, his voice low. "We wait," Miller replied. "Let them make the first move." Time seemed to stretch on as the enemy, unaware of their presence, continued to move around the fire. The tension in the air was thick, the silence almost suffocating. Miller's senses were heightened, every sound amplified, every movement caught out of the corner of his eye. He could hear the rustle of leaves, the crackle of the fire, the distant hum of the convoy engines idling. But the sounds that mattered were the ones that didn't belong. A twig snapped. Miller's hand went to his weapon instinctively. He held his breath. The enemy was moving. He could feel the shift in the air as the sound of boots crunching on the forest floor grew closer. They were coming in from the left, trying to flank them. Miller made eye contact with Hayes, nodding slightly. They had to act quickly before the situation escalated. "On my mark," Miller said, his voice steady and low. "Wait for it, wait for it." The enemy moved closer, their silhouettes now visible in the dim light of the fire. Miller's finger hovered over the trigger. They were almost within range. "Now," Miller shouted. The world erupted into chaos. Gunfire rang out, the sound deafening in the quiet of the forest. The soldiers opened fire, their shots cutting through the air as they took down the first wave of enemies. Miller moved forward, his feet sure as he dropped one enemy soldier after another. His training kicked in, and his experience took over as he led the team in the assault. They were fast, efficient, and precise. But the enemy was not unprepared. They fought back fiercely, their fire growing heavier as they realized the ambush was being turned against them. Miller dove behind a tree, his rifle aimed at the advancing enemy. He fired, taking out 2 more soldiers, but they kept coming. Hayes and the others were doing the same, pushing back the enemy 1 move at a time. But Miller could see it now, the real danger. The camp wasn't just a group of soldiers. It was a decoy. The real threat was coming from the other side, where a second wave of enemy soldiers had begun to move in. More, coming in from the east. Hayes called out over the radio. "We need to fall back now." Miller gritted his teeth. They were outnumbered, and they were surrounded. The convoy had to be moved, and fast. "Fall back to the extraction point," Miller ordered, his voice calm but urgent. "Cover each other. "We're not leaving anyone behind." The soldiers began to pull back, returning fire as they made their way toward the extraction point. Miller kept his focus, covering their retreat, his shots precise as he took down enemy soldiers one by one. The forest around them seemed to come alive with gunfire and chaos, but Miller didn't flinch. He was used to this. This was what he had trained for. The battle raged on, but as the team made their way to safety, Miller knew one thing for certain. This mission wasn't over. It was just beginning. The sound of gunfire continued to echo in the dense forest as the team fell back toward the extraction point. Miller could feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins, but his mind remained as sharp as ever. The situation was critical, and they had no time to waste. The enemy had nearly surrounded them, but they weren't finished yet. Miller's orders were clear: get to the extraction point, cover each other, and don't leave anyone behind. As they moved through the trees, Miller could hear the rapid footsteps of his team behind him, their movements synchronized, their focus unwavering. He could see the enemy advancing from all directions, the shadows of soldiers slipping between the trees like ghosts. The forest had become a maze of danger, but Miller knew it like the back of his hand. He had been in worse situations, but something about this one felt different. The enemy was relentless, and it was clear they were prepared for a prolonged fight. As they neared the extraction point, Miller signaled for the team to take cover. They crouched behind trees and large rocks, their weapons aimed at the enemy's advancing position. The gunfire was deafening now, the sound of bullets cutting through the air, the ground littered with debris and fallen leaves. Miller glanced over at Captain Hayes, who was taking up a defensive position beside him. The two locked eyes for a moment, and without a word, Hayes nodded. They knew what had to be done. The convoy was still, waiting at the extraction point, but the enemy was closing in fast. There was no time to waste. Miller took a deep breath, his hands steady on his rifle as he focused on the advancing enemy. He squeezed the trigger, sending a bullet into one of the soldiers moving through the trees. The enemy soldier dropped, but the rest of them continued to move forward, their fire intensifying. Miller's pulse quickened, but he kept his focus. He wasn't about to let them overwhelm them now. "Keep moving," he shouted to his team, his voice cutting through the noise. "We can't stay here much longer." The soldiers began to retreat once again, their movements swift and practiced. The trees seemed to close in around them as they moved, their hearts pounding with every step. Miller could feel the sweat trickling down his back, but he didn't let it distract him. They were so close now, so close to the extraction point, but the enemy was relentless. They couldn't afford to stop. As they neared the open field where the convoy was waiting, the enemy surged forward, cutting off their path. Miller's instincts kicked in as he turned to face the oncoming threat. "Hold the line," he shouted. "We can't let them trap us here." The soldiers quickly formed a defensive line, their rifles aimed at the approaching enemy. Miller moved forward, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of weakness. The enemy was pushing hard, but Miller could feel their resolve. They weren't going to let them win. The sound of the convoy engines roaring to life reached Miller's ears, and for a brief moment, he felt a surge of hope. They were almost there. But the enemy wasn't about to let them go that easily. Miller fired again, dropping another soldier, but they were still coming. The soldiers continued to return fire, holding their ground, but Miller knew they couldn't stay in one place for too long. He motioned for them to move once again. "Fall back," Miller shouted. "We're almost there. Just a little further." The team moved in unison, their feet quick but careful as they navigated the difficult terrain. The enemy was right behind them now, but they couldn't let it slow them down. As they finally reached the extraction point, Miller turned to face the enemy one last time. He took a deep breath and fired once more, sending a soldier tumbling to the ground. Hayes was already inside one of the vehicles, the rest of the team following close behind. Miller turned to see the last few soldiers scrambling to get in, and for a split second, everything seemed to slow down. But as the final soldier climbed into the vehicle, Miller felt a weight lift from his chest. They had made it. The convoy roared to life, speeding away from the extraction point and into the relative safety of the forest. The enemy continued to fire, but the convoy was out of range. For the first time in what felt like hours, Miller allowed himself to relax. He slumped back into his seat, his breathing heavy but steady. They had done it. The mission was over. But as they drove towards safety, Miller couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The enemy was still out there, and they were going to come for them again. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for now, they had won. They had survived. And that was all that mattered. The convoy finally reached the edge of friendly territory, the tension slowly beginning to drain from the soldiers as they crossed into safer ground. The night sky stretched above them, dotted with stars that felt far too peaceful for the chaos they had just left behind. Miller sat in the back of the lead vehicle, his body stiff with exhaustion, but his mind was still racing. He had led them through another successful mission, but the cost of that victory was becoming clearer with every passing minute. The loss of one of their own still weighed heavily on him, a reminder that no matter how many battles they won, they could never escape the cost of war. "We made it," Hayes said from the driver's seat, his voice calm but edged with fatigue. Miller nodded, his eyes fixed on the dark road ahead. "For now," he replied, the words slipping out without thinking. Hayes glanced over at him, sensing the shift in Miller's mood. "You don't think it's over, do you?" Miller didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out the window, watching the landscape pass by, as if trying to piece together the puzzle of what had just happened. There had been something off about that mission, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The enemy had been prepared, too prepared, and the way they had let the team extract the prisoners without much resistance, it didn't sit right with him. "Something's coming," Miller said finally, his voice low and steady. "I can feel it." Hayes didn't argue. He had seen the way Miller had handled the mission, the way he'd kept his cool under pressure. If Miller said something was wrong, then they had to take it seriously. The convoy continued its journey, but the rest of the ride passed in silence. The soldiers were too exhausted to talk, each lost in their own thoughts, processing what had happened. As they neared the base, the lights of the camp came into view. It was a welcome sight, but it didn't erase the tension still lingering in the air. They had completed their mission, but the feeling of uncertainty hadn't gone away. They were safe for now, but Miller couldn't shake the feeling that their time in the clear was running out. The convoy pulled up to the base, and the soldiers began to disembark. They were greeted by the familiar faces of their comrades, but the usual chatter and camaraderie were absent. There was a heaviness in the air, as if everyone knew they had narrowly escaped something far worse. Miller took a moment to survey the camp, his eyes scanning the perimeter. Everything seemed normal, but there was an underlying tension, an unspoken awareness that something wasn't right. "I'll check in with command," Hayes said, his voice breaking through Miller's thoughts. "See what the next orders are." Miller nodded. "Let me know what they say." As Hayes walked toward the command tent, Miller remained where he stood, watching the other soldiers go about their duties. His mind was still on the mission, on the strange feeling that had lingered throughout. There had been too many close calls, too many signs that pointed to something more, something they weren't being told. He knew they were about to face something bigger, something that would require every bit of experience he had. Just then, a soldier approached him, holding out a small piece of paper. "Sir, this came through for you," the soldier said, his voice tight with unease. Miller took the paper, unfolding it slowly. The message was brief but clear. Operation Omega, imminent. His heart skipped a beat. Operation Omega. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. It was a mission that had been classified beyond top secret, one that no one spoke of unless absolutely necessary. It was the kind of operation that only a select few were ever aware of, and it had always been considered the final option. If they were moving forward with it, things were about to get far more complicated. Miller's mind raced as he processed the words. He knew what it meant, and it wasn't good. Whatever came next would push them to their limits. He folded the paper back up and slipped it into his pocket, his thoughts already shifting to the next step. He couldn't afford to lose focus now. The soldiers were looking to him for leadership, and he couldn't afford to let them down. Hayes returned moments later, his face grim. "Command wants us ready. They've called for immediate action. They won't tell us much more yet." Miller nodded, his gaze steely. "Prepare for anything," he said quietly. "We're about to find out what this is really all about." The soldiers began to gather their gear, moving quickly but with purpose. Miller could feel the tension building once again. They had made it this far, but he knew that what lay ahead would be the hardest part yet. As the night stretched on and the camp came alive with the bustle of preparation, Miller stood at the edge of the base, looking out into the distance. The war wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But he had always believed in the fight, in the need to keep going, no matter the odds. And this time, he would lead them again. He had no choice. The road ahead was uncertain, but Miller knew one thing for sure. He would face whatever came next with everything he had. The mission, and his team, depended on it.